Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving deep into the structural vulnerabilities of Indian manufacturing. We're going to uncover what massive global oil shocks actually mean for the everyday industries we all rely on. So, what really happens to a nation's factories when global oil prices just suddenly spike? Well, we see the headlines all the time, right? Oil prices surging because of some global conflict. But the actual mechanics of how a crisis on the other side of the world eventually hits a local factory floor and ultimately your wallet is a fascinating and honestly kind of concerning story. Let's get into it. Here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. We'll hit the global energy threat, look at who uses the fuel, examine the profit margin squeeze, run a 50% stress test, dive into the systemic industrial crisis, and finally explore the clean energy escape. Section 1. The global energy threat. Let's start by looking at the big picture. You see, the domino effect usually starts thousands of miles away. Geopolitical tensions, like those between Iran and the US, threaten absolutely critical maritime routes, like the Strait of Hormuz. And when supply disruptions loom, global crude oil prices can jump wildly. We're talking going from $80 to over $120 a barrel in a flash. So the crucial takeaway here is that India's structural dependence on imported fuel means a geopolitical hiccup instantly translates into a massive cost crisis for local industries. It's basically an automatic transmission of global stress right onto domestic factory floors. Section 2. Who uses the fuel? Let's look under the hood of Indian manufacturing. Now check out the sheer concentration of risk here. It's wild. A massive 71% of all fossil fuel expenditure in Indian manufacturing is heavily concentrated in just 5 major industries. Basic metals and refined petroleum alone eat up over 40% of the entire pie. So fuel prices spike, these absolute heavyweights bear the largest initial burden in pure dollar terms. But, total spending doesn't exactly equal dependence. While refined petroleum sits at a whopping 41% intensity, look at the smaller sectors. Even the industries making your daily food and clothes rely heavily on fossil fuels just to run their machines. Food products sit at 15% and textiles at 8%. So the exposure isn't just sitting in heavy industry, it's practically everywhere, literally woven into the fabric of our everyday goods. Section 3. The profit margin squeeze. So the question is, do these widespread industries actually have the cash reserves to survive a sudden price shock? Well, this is where things get genuinely alarming. While outliers like tobacco and pharmaceuticals sit super comfortably on huge margins, like 32 and 18%, giving them a nice, thick financial buffer, it is a totally different story for the basics. The industries making our everyday groceries, our shoes, our clothes, they survive on razor-thin margins of just 3 to 7%. Think about that for a second. A 3% margin means there's practically zero room for error. If their costs tick up even a little, they're immediately bleeding money. Section 4. The 50% stress test. This brings us to the real climax of this explainer. Let's run a simulation. We're going to apply a massive 50% price hike to our model, basically keeping all other costs the same, but absolutely skyrocketing fuel. And we aren't just pulling this number out of thin air, by the way. This mirrors a very real-world jump in crude oil from roughly $80 to over $120 a barrel. We're running this stress test to see exactly who survives the pressure when a core input spikes this aggressively. And wow, look at these results. When that 50% fuel hike hits those razor-thin margins, the impact is utterly devastating. Industries operating on a 3 to 7% margin see their profits completely wiped out by a 5 to 11% drop. Take food products, for example. A 5.8% profit decline for an industry that only operates on a 3% margin, that means their entire profit buffer isn't just squeezed, it is simply gone, vanished overnight. Section 5. A systemic industrial crisis. What we're looking at here is a dangerous cascading effect. Because this isn't just a bad financial quarter for a few unlucky companies, right? It's a structural earthquake. Let's trace how it spreads. Core energy sectors get hit first, sure, but then that shock cascades right down the supply chain. Higher costs push down into smaller businesses. MSMEs with extremely limited financial buffers face temporary closures. They literally just can't afford to keep the lights on or the machines running. And finally, all this secondary inflation spreads to intermediate inputs and eventually arrives right at your local store. You feel it in the form of heavy inflation on the final product. The whole system just cracks under the pressure. Section 6. The clean energy escape. So how on earth do we fix an industrial system that's this incredibly fragile? Well, this quote from our source material really hits the nail on the head. It says the shift towards renewable energy is a direct response to economic vulnerabilities, altering the risk profile of industrial production itself. We really have to completely flip our thinking here. Clean energy isn't just some nice-to-have green initiative anymore. It is an absolute economic shield. Relying on imported oil means relying on volatile global prices that you have absolutely zero control over. But transitioning to renewables, that locks in predictable, locally generated costs. It literally saves those low-margin, vital everyday industries from getting totally wiped out by global chaos. Which brings us to our final thought. As global instability continues to simmer in the background, you really have to ask yourself, can our vital, everyday industries actually afford to wait for the next massive price spike? Or is a rapid transition to renewables their absolute only path to survival? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this really helped you see the invisible forces shaping our economy, and I'll leave you to ponder that thought.